Today is Friday, 12th July, and I'm going to start this program by discussing the current situation in the United States and the growing problems that are engulfing the presidency of Joe Biden. And these center on the personality of the president himself. Now, yesterday, the president was due to give a press conference, and he did in fact give a press conference at the conclusion of the NATO summit meeting. It was a press conference that lasted 50 minutes, over the course of which he answered 11 questions. And I should say that this was more than some people had expected that he would do. There were rumors that he would only take 4 questions, but in the event he answered 11. And some are seeing this as some kind of a success on President Biden's part. Now, I have to say that might be true in terms of American politics and perhaps in terms of the president himself. But as someone who has become accustomed to going through the vast press conferences that Vladimir Putin regularly gives, mostly nowadays it must be said, with the Russian media, the contrast is startling. Mostly those press conferences go on for much more than an hour. Many more questions get asked. Sometimes, of course, they go on for many hours, and, well, the transcripts of the press conferences go on for page after page after page of closely argued discussion and explanation from Putin as he responds to the many questions that are put to him. Of course, it's often claimed that Putin is given advance notice of the questions, and that's no doubt true in places. It's also sometimes alleged that the questions are all softball questions. That, by the way, is absolutely not true. But even if you take those views, it is still the case, I want to say again, that the contrast between what some are claiming was a more successful, or rather, shall we say, less unsuccessful Biden press conference and a Putin press conference is nonetheless startling. But anyway, let's put that aside and let's concentrate on the press conference itself. It was built up as the moment when the president would put the doubters at rest, that he would still the swirling controversy around him and his prospects, both in the November election and his candidacy for the Democratic Party. The president, over the last few weeks, has been pushing strongly back against the various attempts that have been made by members of the Democratic Party to get him to step down from his position as the Democratic Party's candidate for the presidency. He's been insisting that he is the right person to conduct the campaign, that he's confident that he will win, that he wants the full support of the Democratic Party. Recently, he wrote a letter to the Democratic Party, to various important people in the Democratic Party, making what I thought was actually the entirely correct point, that this constant discussion of this issue is undermining the prospects of the Democratic Party in the November elections, and that the situation therefore has to be resolved quickly. I think that's absolutely correct. But of course, the president's solution to this problem was that everybody in the Democratic Party get behind and unite behind him. And, well, let me say straightforwardly and very simply that I think that the press conference yesterday and certain things that happened on the eve of it. Far from achieving that objective, which the president and his supporters set for him, well, it's had the opposite effect. In brief, I think it was a disastrous press conference. This is my own view. Some will say that this is an overstated view, but I get the sense that what we saw yesterday was Biden at his current best. I don't think he can perform better than he did yesterday. And I think the universal view, based on what people heard and saw, is that Biden at his current best is nowhere near good enough. Now, I say that, let's just rehearse some of the things that happened, most of which, of course, you, my viewers, already know. Firstly, before the press conference itself, at an absolutely crucial meeting with all the other NATO leaders present, President Biden was there to reaffirm support for Ukraine, and he introduced President Zelensky of Ukraine to the audience, except, of course, that he didn't refer to him as President Zelensky, he referred to him as President Putin, which was embarrassing and comical, and which, incidentally, I feel was also something of a Freudian slip, in the sense that I think that it is Putin who is very much on President Biden's mind, and I do frankly question whether the president any longer has the bandwidth, if you like, to be able to contain both Zelensky and Putin in his memory at one and the same time. Mostly, he thinks about Putin, and I think perhaps as a result, he has less space to think about Zelensky. Just saying. Anyway, on this occasion, Biden noticed the slip and sought to laugh it off, but it's clear that there were many people who were very, very unhappy by what happened. And, well, there's been an article about this in the Daily Telegraph, and it might just be worth recapitulating a little of what that article says. It says that Joe Biden's gaffes have ruined months of hard work and undermined the NATO summit, diplomatic sources told the Telegraph. One would love to know which countries those diplomatic sources came from, but some of them almost certainly were British. After all, the Telegraph is a British newspaper. Anyway, the article then goes on to say, on stage, Emmanuel Macron and Olaf Scholz defended the president over a slip of the tongue in which he called Volodymyr Zelensky President Putin. The US leader went on to call Kamala Harris Vice President Trump. We will come to that slip shortly. But then the Daily Telegraph goes on to say, but roaming the corridors of the summit, aides were more frank in their verdict of the president's performance. It was awful, an official said, describing standing in the crowd as events unfurled. The consensus, and note the Daily Telegraph uses the word consensus, in other words, this is the common view of most of the people. The consensus amongst diplomats and officials who spoke to the Telegraph and were granted anonymity to speak more freely was that it took less than a minute to change the entire narrative of the summit. The sources realized that they would be forced to read about the gaffe on tomorrow's front pages instead of stories of their successes. It has taken the focus away from what has been a great summit for us, a diplomat said. Before I proceed, I am completely at a loss to understand what was so great about this summit. Putting aside what Biden did, to me, other than publish an incredibly belligerent and aggressive final statement, which, by the way, I have now read in full, but to which I will add nothing, about which I will add nothing to what I said yesterday, save, of course, for the fact that some of the leaders who signed that communique, notably Viktor Orban of Hungary, Fico of Slovakia, and Erdogan of Turkey, don't believe a word of it, as you can judge from what they themselves say. Anyway, apart from that, I don't know what exactly it was that this summit achieved that made it a great summit. To me, it was a summit that achieved nothing. But put that aside, this is what the diplomat said. It takes the focus away from what has been a great summit. Before the slip-up, officials and diplomats were overjoyed. I don't know why, but so the Telegraph tells us they were, with the outcomes of the meeting, which marked the alliance's 75th anniversary, with a show of unity in defiance of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Well, of course, a show of unity, which, as I've just said, doesn't actually exist, because Orban, Fico, and Erdogan, amongst others, don't actually agree with this show of unity. They have, in fact, entirely different views. But anyway, there we are. And we're also told that until that moment, the US leader had been almost word perfect, having spoken in every single session of the meeting. Well, one wonders what exactly he did say. And we're also told that NATO members believed that they had done enough to Trump-proof the alliance. Well, as to that, we'll just have to wait and see. And that months of groundwork had been put into preventing another Vilnius moment, a second official said, referring to Zelensky's outburst at last year's summit after being refused an invitation. Well, if that's an achievement, I'm not quite sure why it should be such a great achievement. But anyway, the point is that despite all that, despite all of these imaginary, non-existent achievements, Biden's slip of the tongue apparently was the story that dominated the headlines about the summit. And as we see, according to the Telegraph, the officials there, the NATO officials there, and I suspect some heads of government also, were absolutely furious about what happened. So that was the first part of where the president blundered yesterday. It's important to say that happened before the press conference itself, but then the press conference got underway. And yes, the president did answer questions, but he did so in an increasingly incoherent and rambling way. And he also made all sorts of slips and blunders along the way, which perhaps illustrate further the underlying nature of the problems. Now, if you think this is just my view, let me go again to the British media, and let me go now to news outlets that are strongly sympathetic to Biden, or have been. Let me start with The Guardian, which has been perhaps his most ardent supporter in the media here in Britain. And you had this article by John Crace in The Guardian. You could sense the embarrassment as Biden spoke, a sign of how low the presidency has sunk. The post-NATO press conference was an opportunity for the world to see Biden unscripted, but there was no coming back from the Zelensky-Putin slip-up. And then it goes on to say that the entire press conference was painful to watch, that things, in fact, went from, in some ways, from bad to worse. It says that the post-NATO press conference was the first opportunity for the world to see Biden in the raw since the television debate with Donald Trump a short time ago. Biden unplugged, Biden unscripted. Sure, he could read his opening statement off the autocue, but then he would have to take questions from the media. A test of whether he could hold it together for nearly an hour. That's how low the presidency has sunk. We're obliged to give a president a free pass on the basis of limited information. Things didn't get off to the best of starts. 90 minutes before he gave his press conference, he made that blunder, calling Zelensky Putin. But then it goes on. When he went on to face a hostile media, all were looking for any weakness. The president was no more than a global lab rat. He deserves better than that. Well, maybe he does. But then it became clear that the press conference, it said, wasn't going well. There were many moments when he appeared confused. His sentences would start nowhere in particular and then abruptly tail off. His delivery was dreamy, disconnected, and detached. At one point, during a rambling diversion about Finland, he became distracted and fell silent for a moment. You could sense the embarrassment in the room. The media were reluctant participants at the crime scene. And of course, there were the inevitable gaffes. Mistaking Europe for Asia barely rated a mention. Calling Kamala Harris Vice President Trump certainly did. That sent shockwaves through the nation. You just can't go on making those sort of mistakes and pretend that nothing is the matter. A decline on this scale should never have to be this public. Now, on this blunder on Biden referring to Kamala Harris as Donald Trump, a slip, by the way, which he doesn't seem to have noticed until it was pointed out to him later in the press conference by a reporter. I think we have exactly the same problem. The president is, again, overwhelmingly focused on Trump. He lacks the bandwidth to think of both Trump and Kamala Harris at one and the same time. So the result is that when he talks, the word Trump comes out when, of course, he really should be talking about Harris. But there we are. That's the situation we have with the president at the moment. And then there have been other critical articles. There was two interesting articles in the London Times. There was another discussion of the press conference, this time by David Charter. This is in the London Times. This is Joe Biden's chance to win over doubters. He blew it. The president deflected blame and attacked the polls. As members of his party grow ever more concerned, he will lose to Donald Trump. And it went over much of the same territory all over again. And it made the point that sometimes the president didn't even seem to understand the nature of some of the questions, the purpose of some of the questions that were being put to him, and that he is in denial about some of his problems. So, for example, in this article, we have comments like this. A clear sign that he is in denial about his age-related decline came during a long answer to a simple question. Could he really deal with Presidents Putin or Xi face-to-face in a year or two? The subtext was clear to all. It was another way of asking if Biden recognizes he is not as sharp as he was. But he missed the point. I have no real reason to talk to Putin, he said, but I understand the generic point. Is Putin ready to talk? That was not the intention of the question, but Biden appeared generally to think it was a matter of geopolitics rather than his own personal shortcomings. And the article goes on with other examples of the same kind. And then there's been a very cutting article by Gerard Baker, also in the London Times. Now, this, I believe, was written before the press conference, but it basically, well, it fundamentally criticizes the president for his insistence on remaining in the race and refusing to reconsider his position. And it makes comments like this. Most of all, the blame, risking the country's future, is down to Biden himself. He has said over again that in this year's election, democracy itself is on the ballot, that saving the country from another Trump term is essential to the republic's survival. But even as he saw how voters had recoiled from the thought of 4 more years for him, even as younger, more vigorous, more convincing Democrats were available to make the party's case. By the way, I have no idea who these younger, more vigorous, more convincing Democrats are. Just saying. But anyway, to continue. He refused to budge. In picking Kamala Harris as his vice president 4 years ago, he chose someone most voters think is even less qualified to be president than he is, thereby knowingly making his party's ultimate plight worse. He has behaved like a man committed above all else to his self-interest and that of his family, a man willing to sacrifice his own party and perhaps his country for the sake of clinging to the biggest job in the world. What we become, what we despise, a wise man once said. Who else in this dispiriting American election does that remind you of? Well, I'm not going to answer the last question. But anyway, there we are. Criticism of the president is growing. The press conference has intensified it, and that criticism is starting to gain an edge of disgust. Now, we are, at the moment, or so it seems to me, in the battle between the immovable force, the irresistible force, and the immovable obstacle. The immovable obstacle is, of course, Joe Biden himself. It seems that both he and members of his family and some members of his political team are determined that he will hang on. The irresistible force is a growing tide of opinion within his party. That tide will have grown even further as a result of the performance we saw yesterday. There is now convincing evidence that Barack Obama, the former president, is part of this tide. He's not said anything openly about the president standing down, but it's widely assumed that he gave the green light to the actor George Clooney, who is a major Democratic Party backer and who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times basically calling on the president to stand down. And there are articles, I saw one in the Financial Times, which say that Biden's team now believe that Obama is at the heart of much of the campaign to get the president to stand down. So we have this situation in the United States now, within the Democratic Party, in which the irresistible force is coming into collision with the immovable obstacle. Now, I'm not sure what the solution to all of this is. Maybe the pressure on the president will suffice to get him to change his mind. Maybe it will. There's been suggestions that the 25th Amendment might be invoked. I would point out that the 25th Amendment relates to the presidency. One could, I suppose, in theory, imagine a situation where the 25th Amendment is brought into play, the president is removed from office, but continues to insist that he must remain the candidate, and he's got all of the convention delegates from the primaries supporting him. Well, that, I accept, is a fantastic scenario. Having said that, the 25th Amendment, which I've now read, does provide for removing a president. I don't think it is at all straightforward. There would certainly have to be medical evidence to back that conclusion. I'm not sure to what extent it exists, or whether medical professionals could be found who would endorse it, and what if the president were to find other medical professionals who were to side with him. Then, as I understand it, Congress also has a say, and in the House of Representatives, it is the Republicans, not the Democrats, who are in control. All of this, anyway, would presumably have to be done over the next the next month, before the Democratic Party's convention in Chicago. That perhaps is just about sufficient time, but it would mean that the entire process in the run-up to the convention would be dominated by all the events surrounding that. And it would not be an auspicious start to the convention itself. Anyway, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. It's not my purpose here to try to solve the Democratic Party's problems for them. What I will say is this: internationally, globally, as far as most of the world is concerned, the United States at this moment is leaderless. Putting aside any question about the president's condition, world leaders around the world are seeing that some kind of a power struggle is underway in the United States between the president himself and his own party in the months leading up to an election. They must be saying to themselves that the president, in light of all this, is under such pressure that he's not going to be in a position to make any very clear and effective decisions. That the United States, therefore, from this moment on, until this situation is resolved, is functioning, in effect, on autopilot, and world leaders, world governments, friendly and hostile to the United States, are going to be making their decisions based on that analysis. And I think, and I have to say this, I think that this is a correct analysis. I too cannot see how the president can exercise effective control of the government when he is under this sort of pressure. The other thing that this crisis is going to do is that it is going to make more and more world leaders around the world assume that the next president of the United States is going to be Donald Trump, that it is going to be Donald Trump who is going to win back the presidency in November, and that it will be Donald Trump who will be running things from the White House come January 2025. Now, already we see one world leader who is acting on this basis, Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary. He has been to Ukraine, Russia, and China. He's been to the United States to attend this summit meeting, And he has now gone, I believe, to Florida, where he has met with Donald Trump. And undoubtedly, in his meeting with Donald Trump, he is talking about Ukraine. And Donald Trump's officials are already taking steps which many will see as the first steps, not of a candidate for the presidency in November, but as the first steps of the man who will become president. Apparently, his officials have contacted European governments and have warned them that President Trump intends to scale down intelligence cooperation between the United States and some of the NATO member states. Now, I suspect that there are multiple stories here. Firstly, it does look as if the future president, if it is Donald Trump, is already thinking about putting distance between the United States and the other members of the NATO alliance. But, of course, there is a subplot which many have overlooked, though, of course, Donald Trump himself will not have, and that is that during his first term, a lot of the information that was used against him by his political opponents and indeed by members of the intelligence community in the United States, and which resulted in those various investigations that he was put through. A lot of that information originated with intelligence agencies in Europe. And there's been rumors that the British, Dutch, Italian, and Ukrainian intelligence agencies played a significant role in all of this. Something about which, by the way, I am myself entirely unable to comment. But it looks as if the president, the future president, as he may be, Donald Trump, has concluded that these intelligence agencies are not to be trusted, and for that reason he's going to reduce intelligence sharing with them. And given that many of the European leaders sense that he is more likely than not now going to be the next president of the United States, these briefings are certain to have a chilling effect. It seems to me that the longer this crisis goes on within the Democratic Party, the more we're going to see evidence of power draining away from the president and his administration, and the more people we will see following where Orban has led and beating a path to Donald Trump's door. Trump, for the record, I think has played his cards with some skill over the last few weeks. I thought he put in a clever performance during the television debate, creating the conditions for Biden, in effect, to self-destruct. He's shown great political intelligence in keeping relatively quiet over the last few weeks, even as the crisis within the Democratic Party plays out. And, of course, he is not to be underestimated. We've seen that he seems to have overcome the main challenge, political challenge to himself, presented by the various court cases that were brought against him as a result of that Supreme Court decision. He is not someone to be underestimated, which many people most unwisely repeatedly do. Anyway, there we are. A vacuum of power in Washington, one which is unlikely to be resolved quickly, even if the president is persuaded to step down, the vice president, who will presumably take his place, Kamala Harris, will lack his authority because she was never elected president. She's said to be unpopular and not the first choice of most of the people within her party. And of course, the way in which she will have come to office will undoubtedly be a problem for her. So, a situation where the United States is drifting with a president who is increasingly looking as if he has lost control and leading or purporting to lead an alliance, a NATO alliance, which is, as I discussed in my program yesterday, also drifting into deeper and greater crises with various countries, the Russians, the Chinese, and in other places too. Altogether, a terrible situation, one which should never have been allowed to arise, and which, if I may say it frankly, had politics been conducted in the way in which they used to be conducted in the United States and elsewhere, well, in that case, the situation would not, of course, have arisen. Now, I say all of this, let me now turn to the main crisis, the one that, as I said, President Biden himself is mostly focused on, and that is the crisis in Ukraine. Now, I have been saying for several weeks now that the situation on the battle lines is becoming incredibly fraught, that much of the commentary, people in the West who are shielded from the realities of the war by the often very anodyne reporting that you get in the media, perhaps have not grasped the extent to which the situation in Ukraine has changed dramatically over the last 6 months, and of the extent of the crisis that is playing out there. But anyway, that is my view. And it is also my view that not only is Ukraine's situation deteriorating rapidly, much more rapidly than people understand, but that we are very close now, and perhaps might even have reached the point of no return. Now, two very astute commentators about the war, seem to me to have come to essentially the same conclusion. One was Dima at the Military Summary channel. Now, I often disagree with Dima about particular tactical or strategic assessments, but that's fine. As I said, nobody is obliged to agree with anyone on everything, and we certainly don't. I've always had very great respect for Dima's skills as a reporter of the actual events in the war. And of course, since it is he who watches the videos, the actual battlefield videos, the things that come out from the front lines where the soldiers fight each other and get killed, and where the vehicles are destroyed, and it's he who plots the movements, and it's he who reads all the things that are written on the various telegram channels in Russian and Ukrainian. Well, he has an even closer finger on the pulse of the fighting than I do, a much closer finger, but much better sense of the pulse of events than I do. And he did a long program yesterday on the fighting, which is standard for him, but he also, I noticed, framed the whole program on the basis that the Ukrainian military is starting to lose hope. They're losing hope of victory. They believe that negotiations are going to come at the end of this year, and knowing that, they're no longer prepared to make the kind of sacrifices that they did before, because they sense that those sacrifices are in vain. I said that I don't agree with Dima about everything. I'll say that I think that he has overemphasized a particular observation made by the 79th Brigade, the one that's defending Konstantinovka and which previously defended Novomikhailovka and Paraskovievka in southern Donbass. They said that there is an illness amongst Ukrainian soldiers connected with their belief in negotiations at the end of the year. I don't think that Ukrainian soldiers dread negotiations, which is, I think, how Dima construed it. I think, on the contrary, what the 79th Brigade, which appears to be made up of very dedicated and soldiers filled with patriotic and ideological fervor for the cause of Ukraine and for Maidan. I think what has incensed them is that they sense that most Ukrainian soldiers, recognizing how desperate the situation has become, long for negotiations, hope that negotiations will come at the end of the year, ending the long agony of the war. Anyway, put that aside. The point is that Dima, like myself, has clearly come to the view that Ukraine is reaching the end, the limit of what it can do, that is becoming exhausted. The military there is becoming exhausted. It's losing its ability to keep fighting, and it's the soldiers who make it up are becoming demoralized and grudging of their lives and unwilling to make the sort of sacrifices that they did. And as Dima said, it signals the last stage of the special military operation, the period that will bring us to the run-up to eventual defeat for Ukraine and victory for Russia at the end of this war. Now, that's Dima's take. Another person who, it seemed to me, had come, well, not to identical conclusions, but just conclusions which are in some way similar, is Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis on his absolutely superb YouTube channel. He too, and remember, he is a military officer who has direct experience of battle. He is somebody there who speaks very much of what he knows. By the way, I should quickly add, by way of disclosure of interest, that I know Daniel Davis and we've met and I consider him a friend. Anyway, just saying. Anyway, Daniel Davis also says that Ukraine is now coming close to the point of no return, that unless it can turn the situation on the battlefields, turn it round relatively soon, it will no longer be possible to make that happen. And that, in fact, on the contrary, once we've put past that point of no return, things will start to break down rapidly. I'm perhaps adding things to some of the things that Daniel Davis said. You should go to his YouTube channel and listen to him, and you can get your own view of his analysis. But anyway, the point is that looking at the situation on the battlefronts, it's becoming increasingly clear, not just to me, but I think to other close observers that the situation is going every day from disaster to disaster, and that the Ukrainians themselves are starting to sense this. And you have a clue about this from President Zelensky's recent behavior. He recently went to Poland, as we know. He announced, whilst in this meeting with the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, that Ukraine was giving Poland permission to shoot down Russian missiles over Ukrainian territory if Poland judged that those missiles might be heading towards Poland itself. I and several others have discussed how this was a clear attempt by Zelensky to draw Poland into enforcing what would in effect be a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine. The ploy appeared to work. It appears that Donald Tusk didn't see this coming and was somewhat nonplussed over the course of the press conference that he had with Zelensky. But since then, the Polish government, the Polish defense minister, has come out and has made clear statements that this proposal of Zelensky's is a non-starter. Poland is not shooting down any missiles over Ukrainian territory unless it has the full support of NATO to do so. So Zelensky has been rebuffed on that front. Zelensky's also had a conversation with the British Prime Minister, the new incoming, very inexperienced British Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer. And the story that was spread following that conversation, and which was picked up by the British media, and which appeared to be reinforced by certain statements that Starmer himself had made, was that Britain had, in fact, agreed to allow Ukraine to use Storm Shadow missiles to strike deep inside Russia itself. Now, this would have been a most ominous and worrying development. Just a few weeks ago, following the discussions that were between those German generals, which provided proof that the British were intimately involved in working in preparing the Storm Shadows for launch. That discussion in which the German generals discussed a possible attack on the Crimean Bridge. Anyway, following those disclosures and following some extremely ill-judged comments of the former British Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, that Ukraine had permission to use Storm Shadows in any way that it wanted, including by way of attack on Russian territories and Russian positions on Russian territory. Anyway, the Russians reacted very strongly. They called in the British ambassador to the foreign ministry. They delivered a protest note. They told the ambassador that if anything like that actually did happen, if Storm Shadow missiles were indeed used for strikes deep inside Russia, Russia reserved the right to retaliate, and that they would retaliate against British military positions and facilities anywhere in the world, which by implication could extend to Britain itself. The British were clearly shocked by the Russian response. There was very, very little discussion about it in the media in London. And anyway, what Zelensky tried to do was, in effect, get Starmer to renew the commitment which Cameron had previously made and which the Russians had protested about. Well, he then spread the story, and the British media to some extent spread the story, that permission had in fact been given, that Starmer had indeed agreed to go where Cameron had previously said, to disregard the warning from Moscow and to greenlight missile attacks using Storm Shadow missiles deep inside Russian territory. And then, of course, shortly after, the retreat came, because the British then had to issue clarification that Starmer's words had been misunderstood, that the British had not authorised the use of Storm Shadow missiles to attack targets deep inside Russia at all, that Storm Shadow missiles could be used by Ukraine to attack Russian targets on the Ukrainian battlefields and in Crimea, but that this did not extend to permission to attack Russian targets inside Russia. So, this is the first confirmation, by the way, that the British have not only heeded the warning they were given by the Russians a few weeks ago, but are in effect complying with it, that they are going to do what the Russians demanded that they should do, which is accept the Russian red line, desist from missile attacks on Russian territory using Storm Shadows, knowing that if they were to do that, the Russians themselves had reserved the right to respond. So, all that Zelensky has done is expose the extent of a British climb down, from the original position taken by David Cameron, which had appeared to authorise strikes on Russia itself. So that was another thing that Zelensky tried to do, and we see that it didn't succeed. And then Zelensky has also been busy trying to do something else. He has been intensively lobbying the US government and getting all his friends in Washington and elsewhere to lobby for him, the US government, to get the United States to agree to allow missile strikes on Russian positions using ATACMS missiles much further inside Russia than the permission that has already been given. And for a time, it looked as if this particular ploy would succeed. And in fact, there were reports starting to circulate which suggested that it had done. But yesterday, we got confirmation from the White House that after obviously considering the position and no doubt consulting with the Pentagon, the United States is sticking to its original position that ATACMS missiles cannot and will not be used in strikes on Russian territory, and that the permission given to Ukraine to conduct strikes on Russian territory does not extend beyond the border areas in the area around Kharkiv. So, what Zelensky has done is actually confirm that for the moment the Western powers are observing Russian red lines. Now, there's been much comment about how the West constantly sweeps past red lines and the Russians wring their hands and do nothing. We see that, in fact, and we have Zelensky to thank for this, that at the moment the Western powers are adhering to Russian red lines. They're not the Poles are not going to shoot down Russian missiles in Ukraine, in the airspace of Ukraine. The British are not going to assist with Storm Shadow attacks on Russian territory. That's the first public admission to that effect that the British have made, and the Americans are not going to allow strikes with ATACMS missiles deep inside Russia. So this campaign that Zelensky has been organizing over the last few weeks has not only failed, but it has backfired. Now, the key point is that Zelensky has been conducting this campaign because in every case, in each one of these examples, what he is trying to do is try to draw the Western powers deeper into the conflict. The Poles by shooting down missiles, the British by launching missile strikes alongside the Ukrainians into Russia, the Americans by getting them to launch missiles alongside the Ukrainians deep into Russia. And the reason Zelensky has been doing this, he's been trying to get NATO to interfere and involve itself in the war, is because he knows that he is losing the war and losing it badly. And, well, those comments have now been supported. This retreat, if you like, has now been supported by President Macron of France, who only a short time ago was the ultimate hardliner, the person who was prepared to send French troops to fight in Ukraine. He's pulled back, he's rowing back after the French European Parliament and legislative elections, where parties that are overwhelmingly opposed to French involvement in the Ukraine war, President Macron at the NATO summit has now said this: although the direct involvement of the alliance in the Ukrainian conflict is ruled out, it is very important that the allies continue to provide effective support. Russia must not win. Not just Ukraine's future is at stake. It's about peace and security of everyone on the continent. But note, direct involvement of the alliance, of NATO, in the Ukrainian conflict is ruled out. Not just NATO, of course, but specifically France as well. Because without NATO, France, as Macron knows perfectly well, cannot move. So, a void in Washington, anti-war sentiment growing in Europe, Zelensky desperate. He's desperate because he's losing the war. He knows that the Ukrainian army is becoming exhausted. He's been pleading for help. He's not getting help. What is the situation on the front lines? Is Zelensky justified in becoming as desperate as he obviously is? Well, we've had a cascade of reports over the last couple of days. In fact, there's been so many that it's difficult to know where to begin and into how much detail one should go. If one goes into full detail, then of course one would be here describing events not for the long time that I do discuss things in my videos, but for multiple times longer. But let's first of all begin with Kharkiv region, where the Russians crossed the border back in May and where there's been fighting ever since, fighting around Lipsy and fighting in the town of Volchansk. Now, this was going to be the area where the Ukrainians were going to conduct their counteroffensive, their latest counteroffensive. They were going to launch a counteroffensive to drive the Russians back across the border, and this counteroffensive was clearly urged on them by the Western powers and was to be timed with the NATO summit meeting. There has been intense Ukrainian counterattacks towards the village of Gluboka near Lipsy, the village of Lipsy. The Ukrainians managed to occupy a part of Gluboka, perhaps 40% of it. They appear to have been stopped. They have suffered horrendous losses, and there has been no successful counterattack anywhere else. The Ukrainians committed a huge amount of resources to try to get a counterattack up and running. They sent fighter jets to their air bases in Mirnograd and Poltava, where many of their best fighter jets were destroyed. They've suffered massive losses in terms of troops and equipment. All they have to show for it are a few streets in a small village, and that counterattack appears now to have run out of steam, and the latest reports is that the Russians are now counterattacking in Gluboka and look like they're going to push the Ukrainians back from the positions that they have recaptured. The New York Times has published an article that now admits that Ukraine is unable to launch a counteroffensive anywhere along the contact line this year. It attributes this to the lack of aid from the Western powers. It has still not been sufficient at the level that Ukraine needs. Some NATO countries have not yet been able to start production and purchase of certain weapons for Ukraine's armed forces. Well, I discussed recently how an article in Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, shows that the Europeans are only producing a third of the shells that they promised. That President Pavel's plan to buy shells on the international arms market has been an absolute debacle and has failed to produce even a fraction of the shells that were promised. And of course, the same applies to in all sorts of areas as well. And the New York Times admits that the conflict has depleted arms stocks and has demonstrated the inability of governments and defense companies in the West to ramp up arms production. In sharp contrast, by the way, to what the Russians are doing. Now, of course, if you go to the new Atlas, the YouTube channel hosted by Brian Beletic, who, again, to declare an interest, I consider a personal friend, well, you will find that Brian Beletic has been discussing all of this, all the way back to 2022. He has been proved spectacularly, sensationally right about this, though, of course, you won't find anyone in Western governments or official media who will say so. So, going back to the situation in Kharkiv, the great Ukrainian counterattack, all it managed was to capture some streets in Gluboka at horrendous cost, and it looks like the Ukrainians are going to be pushed out of those streets at some point over the next few days. Further east, in the key city of Volchansk, the situation looks, if the reports are true, disastrous. I say if the reports are true because they've not been confirmed by the Russian Defense Ministry or Group of Forces North, and we still do not have full film and photographic evidence to confirm this. But it does seem that the Russians have indeed crossed the Volcha River, that they have entered into the central areas, or rather the southern areas of Volchansk. It seems also that there is a general retreat of Ukrainian troops from northern Volchansk across the Volcha River. In other words, the Ukrainians are abandoning their positions north of the Volcha River as they try to hold the Russians back in this bridgehead that the Russians have established south of the Volcha River. And, well, one way or the other, it's now increasingly looking as if Volchansk is gradually coming under Russian control. Now, there is some question about how stable or strong the Russian bridgehead south of the Volcha River and perhaps also west of the Volcha River towards Volchansk railway station actually is. I am not going to discuss that in this program because I don't know, for one thing. But all I will say is it is clear that the Russians are now definitely have the ascendancy in the fighting in Volchansk. If we go further south, in the area of the Zherebets and Oskol rivers, south of Kupiansk, well, it looks as if the Russians have now broken into Makeyevka. Fighting is indeed apparently happening in that small town. It looks as if the Russians have cut Makeyevka in two, and everybody expects that Makeyevka will quickly fall to the Russians. And that will, as I understand it, fairly rapidly lead to the Russians consolidating control on the east bank of the Zherebets River, capturing places like Terny and other places as well. Further south still, in Chasiv Yar, the Russians have completed the clearing of the micro-district east of the aqueduct. They're apparently now reorganizing and consolidating their forces on the northern and southern flanks of Chasiv Yar. There's also apparently fierce fighting underway for control of the road from the micro-district to central Chasiv Yar. The Ukrainians are trying to slow the Russian advance there as well. And the Russians are continuing their campaign of bombing and of shelling of Chasiv Yar. Further south of Chasiv Yar, the Russian advance in New York, in the Toretsk area, continues. The Russians appear to have cleared more of the fortified areas. They're now well in the central district of New York. They've apparently reached the main Ukrainian fortified positions in New York, which were supposed to be, by the way, positions which the Ukrainians were intended to fall back on if their fortifications further east had fallen, something which was expected to happen only after months or perhaps years of fighting, but which has instead taken place within the space of a few weeks. And the advance by the Russians in this area, in New York, in Toretsk generally, is unstoppable. But the greatest disaster of all, as I've discussed many times, is happening west of Avdiivka and Ocheretino. The Ukrainians now admit, apparently, to the loss of Voshchod and Yevgenivka. That means that the Russians are now at the gates, if you like, of the next village, Progress. They appear to have broken into the village of Novoselivka Persha. There's been apparently a Russian attack towards Novoselivka Persha from the north. This is a major it's a tiny village, but heavily fortified by the Ukrainians, mostly encircled by the Russians now. And the Russians have now broken into the village itself from the north, and there are some suggestions that the Ukrainian defences in Novoselivka Persha have been reduced to 2 pockets. We'll see. But anyway, the fighting is going on there as well. And perhaps most dangerous for the Ukrainians of all, further north of Novo-Alexandrovka. The Russians have advanced north of Novo-Alexandrovka. They are now creeping northwards towards Vozhizhenka. They are apparently now within sight of the outlying buildings of this village. And of course, once the storming of Vozhizhenka is completed, once Vozhizhenka is brought under Russian control, the critical supply road from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar will be physically cut by the Russians. And of course, it is also the main supply line for the Ukrainian grouping in Toretsk. So, a major operational crisis for the Ukrainians in this area. And as I've discussed in many previous programs, the Ukrainians have failed to create any fortifications of significance in this area. All the famous talk of a Ukrainian equivalent to the Surovikin line has proved to be a mirage, with the Russians now close to the soft underbelly of the Ukrainian forces in Donbass, the supply cities of Pokrovsk, Kurakhovo, and Selidovo. And last but absolutely least in this summary, it seems that the Battle of Krasnogorovka may now finally be in its last hours. The Ukrainians have gradually withdrawn from this town, bitterly fought over town. All of the major places, the park area that I've been talking about, all the buildings, all the main buildings are now fully under Russian control. The Ukrainians still apparently have a presence in some low-rise houses, old houses, to the north, very tip of the northwest of Krasnogorovka. But it's likely that they will abandon their positions there also. Now, what I not appreciated about Krasnogorovka is that there is a sort of built-up area, kind of street with houses and buildings on either side that is along a main road, along a street, which projects from the main urban area of Krasnogorovka towards the west. And the Ukrainians apparently do still have a presence there. And it will not be correct to say that the whole of Krasnogorovka has been captured until this particular street with its buildings is captured as well. But with all of the rest of Krasnogorovka about to fall under Russian control, it is only a question of time before this area falls under Russian control also. So this is the situation. Russia continuing to advance along a broad front. The Ukrainians reduced the shuttling forces between one front and another, creating gaps in their front lines as they do so, which the Russians then immediately exploit. The Russians, with total air supremacy, bombing the Ukrainians all the time with massive fab bombs and all sorts of other things, and with the preponderance of Russian power increasing as the Ukrainian army itself loses hope and as President Zelensky becomes more and more desperate. And of course, Zelensky himself came away with nothing from the summit meeting in Washington. He didn't get the $300 billion of Russian assets that he perhaps hoped at one time would be handed to him. The reason is that the Saudis warned that if those assets were seized, they would pull all their assets out of Europe, and the Europeans were not prepared to take that risk. So he didn't get that. He didn't get the permission, the agreements of the Poles, the British, and the Americans that I've discussed earlier in the program. He didn't get a commitment or a timeline or a process for Ukraine to join NATO. There was a lot of talk that that would come, but nothing of that kind emerged from the NATO summit meeting. Nor did he get any further commitment to advance Ukraine's application to join the EU. He has literally come away from the summit meeting in Washington empty-handed. There's a $40 billion package of aid for Ukraine, but this is a drop in the water relative to Ukraine's needs, which are growing all the time. Now, there continues to be a certain degree of magical thinking. I discussed recently how some people in the administration have apparently reassured Politico that once Western weapons arrive in quantities, the situation on the front lines will be stabilized, and that will then put Ukraine in a better position where it can negotiate, or perhaps more properly, dictate terms to the Russians. Well, this is magical thinking. Ukraine is not going to get the shells that it wants. Its fighter jets, the F-16s, are not going to change the course of the war. There is a lot of talk now in Europe of trying to find means to get all those Ukrainians who live in the West, in Poland and Germany in particular, to force them into the Ukrainian army in order to fight. Something which completely violates, by the way, fundamental legal norms in the West. But hey-ho, who cares about that anymore? Dragooning men unwilling to fight into battle, as we have seen, is not in any way a recipe for success, especially not in this war, especially when the equipment is not there to arm them, and especially when the training is not there, the training systems are not there to train them. And, well, we've now had the most fantastic idea of all, discussed recently by Simplicius the Thinker in an excellent piece that he's written at Substack. This idea, which either way I've been reading and hearing about for some time now, of the West putting together this vast fleet of AI-guided aerial drones which will submerge the Russians in attacks across the entire front lines, forcing the Russians to stop their offensive and to come to the table and to capitulate to the Ukrainians. And this is the new miracle that's going to change the course of the war. All Ukraine has to do, apparently, is to hold out for a year, pretty tall order in itself, and then this vast drone fleet will fly or buzz to its rescue. Of course, there is nothing quite like coming up with a plan of this kind and giving the other side a year's advance notice of it. Last year, as I remember, the West and the Ukrainians decided that they would launch this great offensive in Zaporozhye region, and they told the Russians about it about 6 months ahead of its launch, about more than 6 months ahead of its launch. The Russians knew all the plans. They knew exactly where the blow would fall. They were given all the time they needed to prepare. They put it to very good use. They built the Surovikin line. They trained and organized their troops. And lo and behold, the offensive was a complete disaster. So why not do the same thing all over again, but this time in connection with your great AI drone fleet? Why not tell the Russians a whole year in advance that this great drone fleet is coming? Of course, the Russians don't have any kind of technology of their own to respond to this. Their army is equipped with shovels, as the British Defence Ministry formerly told us. They don't have AI technologies of their own. They aren't able to come up with countermeasures or devise strategies because they're technologically primitive compared to the West, and they lack tech flexibility and initiative. That's what, of course, we tell ourselves. So we can announce this plan, forewarn the Russians of what we're going to do, and in a year's time, it's going to succeed, and it is going to turn the situation completely round. Well, if you detect irony or even sarcasm in some of the things that I'm saying, you'd be absolutely justified, because I think this whole thing is preposterous. Putting aside the fact that we are talking here about a significant industrial and technological challenge to get a fleet of this size organized properly in just a year's time. And I repeatedly said that people do not understand the complexities of industrial manufacturing in the West, and that this has been proved to be a major weakness. Well, put all that aside. The Russians are going to take countermeasures to respond to this before they happen. They are, in fact, highly skilled in AI technologies. There's even a report somewhere that says that they are ahead of the military application of AI, as they have demonstrated on these Ukrainian battlefronts with their own drones. And they are taking every single step that they need to harden their tanks and armored vehicles, to equip their forces with anti-drone defenses, and to develop AI fleets of drones of their own, some of which I suspect will be used to target Ukrainian drones. So we will have fights between drones in the air, but with the Russians always, of course, having the numerical and industrial advantage. And just to say that drones, effective as they can be, can only carry a limited amount of explosive, a small, relatively small explosive charge. Make them bigger so that they can carry a larger charge, and, well, the drones become easy to detect and to destroy in the air. So you have to keep them relatively small, and that means that each individual drone can only do a limited amount of damage by itself. So what you are in effect doing is trying to substitute simple, powerful artillery shells, of which the Russians have an infinite number, with far more expensive, far more complex AI drones that carry only a limited charge and which can only do a limited amount of damage. So the Russians will counter this. They will find the way to do it. It is not going to change the arc of the war. It is only going to result in a further debacle. But there it is. When you have the leadership crisis in the West that we see, of which the most serious part is in the United States, then unsurprisingly, in the absence of policy decisions, which no one any longer is in a position to affect, all sorts of magical thinking steps in. And this is what the great drone fleet amounts to, at least in my opinion. Anyway, there we are. This is where I finish my program today. The crisis of leadership, the crisis of power in the United States is not, of course, just a crisis over the war in Ukraine. It is also potentially a crisis over economic policy. Markets are going to be making the same assessments as world leaders, that the United States at the moment is effectively leaderless at the very highest level, and that might have significant bearing on events also. And of course, the world is an immensely complicated place. Crises could spring up anywhere at any time. And of course, we already have a festering crisis in the Middle East and another crisis possibly brewing in the Asia Pacific. But the vacuum of leadership is there. I don't know what is going to happen to overcome it. I don't know whether it can be overcome at any point between now and January of next year, just saying. But in the meantime, it is now indisputable that the Russians are winning in Ukraine and that Ukraine itself is running out of everything, of men, machines, and time. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget also to check out our shop where you can still get Football 24 things. The final is, of course, tomorrow. And in the meantime, let me apologise for the late publication of my programme yesterday. That was caused by a major internet blackout, which took place in this part of London, which lasted for 20 hours, by the way, but there it is. Hopefully, those problems are now behind us. More from me, therefore, soon, and have a great day.